Eleanor Grayson's hands trembled as she gripped the banister of her sprawling Victorian home. At 78, her body was a map of timelines etched deep, joints creaking like the old oak floors beneath her. The house, once alive with laughter, was now a mausoleum of memories. Her 3 children, Margaret, Thomas, and Clara, had long since moved out, building their own lives, their own families. They called occasionally, visited rarely. Eleanor didn't mind the solitude. She'd grown accustomed to it, even fond of it. But tonight, something felt wrong. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and dust, and the grandfather clock in the hall ticked louder than usual. Eleanor descended the stairs, her slippered feet careful but unsteady. She was halfway down when her vision blurred, a sudden dizziness seizing her. Her hand slipped, and the world tilted. She fell, tumbling down the last few steps, her frail body hitting the hardwood with a sickening thud. Pain shot through her hip, her wrist, her pride. She lay there, gasping, the cold floor biting into her skin. "Help," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The house was silent, mocking her fragility. She dragged herself to the phone on the side table, her fingers fumbling for the buttons. She dialed Margaret, her eldest. No answer. Thomas, her middle child. Voicemail. Clara, the youngest, picked up on the third ring. "Mother, what's wrong?" Clara's voice was sharp, tinged with impatience. "I fell," Eleanor rasped. "I need help." Clara sighed, a sound Eleanor knew too well. "Stay there. I'll call an ambulance." Within 20 minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the night. Paramedics stormed into the house, their boots heavy on the floor Eleanor had polished for decades. They lifted her onto a stretcher, their hands gentle but impersonal. As they wheeled her out, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the hall mirror, pale, disheveled, a stranger to herself. The hospital loomed ahead, a place she'd avoided since her husband's death 10 years prior. At St. Mary's Medical Center, the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry bees. Doctors poked and prodded, their faces a blur of professionalism. "A fractured hip," they said. "Possible concussion. She needs surgery, rehabilitation, maybe even a nursing home." The words stung more than the pain in her bones. A nursing home. Eleanor Grayson, who'd raised 3 children, managed a household, and buried a husband, reduced to a bed in some sterile facility. The thought was unbearable. Margaret arrived first, her heels clicking on the linoleum. She was 52, a corporate lawyer with a penchant for control. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, her face a mask of concern that didn't reach her eyes. "Mother, thank God you're okay," she said, but her tone was clipped, as if Eleanor's fall was an inconvenience. Thomas followed, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. At 48, he was a real estate developer, always chasing the next deal. His tie was loosened, his eyes darting to his phone every few seconds. "You scared us," he said, but his voice lacked warmth. Clara was last, her curly hair a mess, her eyes red from crying or lack of sleep. At 42, she was the artist, the free spirit who'd never quite settled down. "I came as soon as I could," she said, squeezing Eleanor's hand. It was the only touch that felt genuine. They stood around her bed, their faces a mix of duty and discomfort. Eleanor studied them, her children, her legacy. She'd given them everything: private schools, college funds, trust accounts she'd meticulously built with her late husband, Robert. The trust funds were her pride, a safety net for her children and their children. Each held millions, carefully invested, meant to secure their futures. But as she looked at them now, she saw something else: greed, distance, calculation. You need to rest, Margaret said, her voice authoritative. We'll handle everything. Everything? Eleanor asked, her voice weak but sharp. The house, your care, the finances, Thomas added, his eyes flicking to Margaret. We'll make sure you're taken care of. Clara nodded, but her gaze was on the floor. Eleanor's heart sank. She knew that look, that avoidance. They weren't here for her. They were here for the money. The doctor returned with a clipboard. Mrs. Grayson, we're scheduling surgery for tomorrow. Your family can discuss long-term care options. Long-term care. Eleanor's voice cracked. I'm going home. Margaret's lips thinned. Mother, be reasonable. You can't manage that house alone anymore. I've managed just fine, Eleanor snapped. But her strength was fading. The painkillers were kicking in, clouding her thoughts. She closed her eyes, the voices of her children fading into a hum. They were talking about her, not to her. About the house, the costs, the trust funds. Always the trust funds. As sleep pulled her under, a memory surfaced: Robert, sitting at their kitchen table, his glasses perched on his nose. Eleanor, he'd said, the money is for them, but only if they deserve it. You'll know when the time comes. The time had come. Eleanor woke to the sterile beep of hospital monitors. Her hip ached, a dull throb that pulsed with every heartbeat. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, but she could make out the shapes of her children in the corner, whispering. Their voices were low, urgent, like conspirators in a play. She kept her eyes half closed, listening. We can't keep paying for that house, Margaret said, her tone sharp. It's a money pit. She needs to sell it. And go where? Clara asked, her voice softer but laced with frustration. A nursing home. She'll hate it. She doesn't get a say, Thomas cut in. She's not competent anymore. That fall proves it. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Competent. She'd balanced their family's books for decades, outsmarted financial advisors, and kept the trust funds growing even after Robert's death. She was frail, not feeble-minded, but they were already rewriting her story, casting her as the helpless old woman. We'll need access to the trust, Margaret continued, to cover her care. Obviously. Obviously, Thomas echoed, but there was a hunger in his voice that made Eleanor's stomach churn. Clara hesitated. Shouldn't we ask her first? Margaret scoffed. She's medicated. Clara. She's not thinking clearly. We'll handle it. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the bedsheet. Handle it. They thought she was out of the game, a pawn to be moved. But Eleanor Grayson was no pawn. She'd been a queen her whole life, and queens didn't surrender. The nurse came in, checking her chart, and the conversation stopped. Eleanor pretended to sleep, her mind racing. She needed a plan, something to protect what she and Robert had built. The trust funds weren't just money. They were a promise, a legacy meant for those who valued family, not those who saw it as a bank account. By morning, the fog of painkillers had lifted enough for her to think clearly. She asked for her lawyer, Mr. Hawthorne, a man who'd served her family for 30 years. The nurse hesitated, glancing at Margaret, who was hovering nearby. My lawyer, Eleanor repeated, her voice firm despite the pain. Now. Margaret's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Fine. Mother. I'll call him. Mr. Hawthorne arrived that afternoon, his suit as crisp as ever, his briefcase a familiar sight. He was in his 60s, with a kind face but a mind like a steel trap. Eleanor trusted him implicitly. They spoke alone. The door closed. Her children relegated to the hallway. "Eleanor," he said, his voice warm but concerned. "What's this about?" "They're after the trust funds," she said bluntly. "They think I'm done for. That they can take control. I want to protect it." Hawthorne nodded, unsurprised. He'd seen families fracture over money before. The trusts are airtight. But if they claim you're incapacitated, they could petition for guardianship. That would give them access. "Then we change the terms," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "Now." "It's not that simple," Hawthorne cautioned. "You'd need to prove you're of sound mind. And with your current condition, I'm as sharp as ever." She interrupted. "And I'll prove it." They spent an hour drafting a new plan. Eleanor would amend the trust, redirecting the funds to a charitable foundation unless her children met specific conditions she'd reveal only when the time was right. It was a gamble, but Eleanor was a master at playing the long game. As Hawthorne left, promising to finalize the documents, Eleanor felt a spark of her old fire. Her children thought they could outmaneuver her, but they'd forgotten who she was. She'd raised them, loved them, but she wouldn't let them betray her. That evening, her children returned, their faces a mix of false concern and barely concealed impatience. "What did Hawthorne want?" Margaret asked, her tone too casual. "Just tying up loose ends," Eleanor said, her voice sweet but laced with steel. "You know how I like to keep things in order." Thomas frowned, sensing something amiss. But Clara just squeezed her hand again. "We're here for you, Mom," she said, and Eleanor almost believed her. Almost. The hospital became Eleanor's battlefield. Surgery was scheduled for the next morning, and the doctors warned her recovery would be long and grueling. She nodded, feigning compliance, but her mind was elsewhere. The trust funds were her leverage, her children's true motives her ammunition. She needed to test them, to see how far their greed ran. Margaret took charge, as always, coordinating with the doctors and social workers. She spoke of options for Eleanor's future assisted living, in-home care, all framed as concern but dripping with control. Thomas was quieter, but his eyes betrayed him, always calculating, always planning. Clara was the wild card, her emotions raw but her loyalty unclear. Eleanor played her part, letting them think she was weak, confused. She asked simple questions, repeated herself, let her voice tremble. It was a performance, one she'd honed raising 3 headstrong children. She watched their reactions, noting every glance, every sigh. Margaret grew more confident, Thomas more dismissive, Clara more conflicted. That night, alone in her room, Eleanor called Hawthorne again. "I need a witness," she said. "Someone impartial to document what I'm about to do." Hawthorne sent his paralegal, a young woman named Sarah, who arrived with a notepad and a recorder. Eleanor liked her immediately sharp. No nonsense, but kind. "Record everything," Eleanor instructed. "Every word they say." The next morning, post-surgery, Eleanor was groggy but alert. Her hip was a mass of pain, but her mind was ablaze. She gathered her children around her bed, her voice frail but deliberate. "I've been thinking about the trust funds," she said, watching their faces light up like predators scenting blood. "I want to make sure you're all taken care of." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "That's wise, Mother. We can manage them for you." "Manage them?" Eleanor echoed, her tone innocent. "What do you mean?" Thomas jumped in. We'd invest them properly. Make sure they grow. You don't need the stress. Clara said nothing, but her hands twisted in her lap. A nervous habit from childhood. Eleanor pressed on. And what would you do with the money? For yourselves. I mean. The room went quiet. Margaret recovered first. We'd use it to ensure your care. Of course. And secure our futures. Like you always wanted. Secure your futures. Eleanor repeated. Her voice soft but cutting. By selling my home. By putting me in a facility. Clara flinched. But Margaret didn't blink. It's what's best. Mother. You can't live alone anymore. Eleanor let the silence stretch, her eyes moving from one child to the next. I see, she said finally. I'll think about it. They left, satisfied they'd won her over. But Sarah, hidden behind the curtain, had recorded every word. Eleanor smiled. A small, dangerous smile. Her children thought they were playing her. But the game was hers. Recovery was a slow burn. Each day a test of Eleanor's endurance. The hospital bed was her prison. The pain her captor. But her resolve was unshakable. She spent her days listening, observing, piecing together her children's intentions. Margaret was the ringleader, orchestrating meetings with financial advisors, her voice carrying through the thin hospital walls. Thomas was her enforcer, nodding along, his ambition clear. Clara was the weak link, torn between loyalty and temptation. Eleanor's plan took shape. She instructed Hawthorne to draft a new trust agreement, one that would lock the funds away unless her children proved their loyalty. The conditions were simple but brutal. They had to live with her, care for her, for 1 year. No selling the house, no nursing homes. If they refused, the money would go to Chirisha Foundation for Elderly Care, a cause close to Eleanor's heart. Hawthorne warned her it was risky. They could challenge it in court, he said. Claim coercion or mental instability. Let them try, Eleanor replied. I've got proof. Sarah's recordings were her ace. Hours of conversations, captured in secret, revealing her children's true colors. Margaret's cold pragmatism, Thomas's greed, Clara's indecision, they were all there, laid bare. Eleanor had the evidence, but she needed to use it wisely. She called a family meeting, her voice weak but commanding. Her children gathered, expecting another discussion about her care. Instead, she dropped the bombshell. I've changed the trust, she said, her eyes locked on theirs. The money is still yours, but there are conditions. Margaret's face hardened. What conditions? You live with me. For 1 year. You care for me. In my home. No institutions. No selling the house. If you don't, the money goes to charity. The room erupted. Margaret called it blackmail. Thomas accused her of losing her mind. Clara just stared, tears in her eyes. Eleanor didn't flinch. It's your choice, she said. Prove you're my family, or lose it all. They left in a fury, but Eleanor knew they'd be back. The money was too much to walk away from, and she was counting on it. Eleanor returned home 3 weeks later, her hip still tender, but her spirit fierce. The house felt different now, less a sanctuary and more a battleground. Her children agreed to her terms, grudgingly, their eyes on the prize. Margaret moved in first, taking over the guest room with an air of martyrdom. Thomas followed, his suitcase packed lightly, as if he didn't plan to stay long. Clara was last, her belongings a chaotic mix of art supplies and clothes, her presence a mix of guilt and hope. The first month was tense. Margaret treated the house like a project, reorganizing everything. her efficiency bordering on disrespect. Thomas was rarely home, citing business but always checking in, his eyes scanning the rooms like a vulture. Clara tried hardest, cooking meals, sitting with Eleanor, but her efforts felt forced, like a child seeking approval. Eleanor watched, waited, tested. She left financial documents out, baiting them. Margaret took the bait, poring over the trust details, her notes meticulous. Thomas asked pointed questions about the estate's value. Clara avoided the topic, but her silence spoke volumes. One night, Eleanor overheard Margaret and Thomas in the kitchen. "She's bluffing," Margaret whispered. "She won't give it to charity. She loves us too much." "Then why make us jump through hoops?" Thomas replied. "She's punishing us." Clara's voice broke in. "Maybe she just wants us here. Maybe she's lonely." Margaret laughed. A cold, cutting sound. "Lonely. She's manipulating us. Clara, don't be naive." Eleanor's heart ached, but she pushed it down. This was her test, and they were failing. 6 months in, the facade cracked. Margaret's patience wore thin, her temper flaring over small things. Eleanor's slow movements. The house's upkeep. Thomas grew bolder, suggesting they consult a lawyer to challenge the trust. Clara withdrew, spending hours painting in the attic, her conversations with Eleanor growing shorter. Eleanor pushed harder. She feigned memory lapses, asked them to recount old family stories, watching for sincerity. Clara's stories were vivid, tinged with nostalgia. Margaret's were curt, factual. Thomas barely bothered, his mind elsewhere. One evening, Eleanor staged her final test. She left a fake document on the dining table, a draft of the trust's charitable transfer. Margaret found it first, her face paling. "She's serious," she hissed to Thomas. "She's giving it all away." "We need to act," Thomas said. "Get her declared incompetent." Clara overheard, her voice shaking. "You can't do that. She's our mother." "She's playing us," Margaret snapped. "And you're falling for it." Eleanor stepped into the room, her cane tapping the floor. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through their argument. "I heard everything." They froze, caught. Eleanor held up the fake document. "This was a test. And you failed." Eleanor called Hawthorne the next day. The trust was finalized, the funds redirected to the foundation. Her children would get nothing unless they changed, truly changed. She gave them one last chance, laying out the recordings, the evidence of their betrayal. Margaret was furious, accusing Eleanor of cruelty. Thomas stormed out, vowing to fight her in court. Clara stayed, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want the money," she said. "I just wanted you." Eleanor wanted to believe her, but trust was a fragile thing. She gave Clara a choice: stay, without the promise of money, or leave. Clara stayed. The house grew quieter. Margaret and Thomas cut contact, their lawyers circling like sharks. Eleanor focused on Clara, rebuilding what they could. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. A year later, Eleanor sat in her garden, the sun warm on her face. Her hip had healed, her spirit stronger than ever. Clara was still there, painting, laughing, learning to be a daughter again. The trust funds were gone, donated to a foundation that helped elderly people live with dignity. Margaret and Thomas had lost their court battle, their greed their undoing. Eleanor didn't regret it. She'd kept her promise to Robert, to herself. The money was never the point. It was about family, trust, love. Clara was proof it wasn't all lost. As she sipped her tea, Eleanor smiled. She'd fallen, but she'd risen. And in the end, she'd helped herself not to money, but to truth.